The smell of expensive cigars and old spilled whiskey is the perfume of my childhood. In the Morty household, we didn't have fairy tales. We had ledgers, we had silence, and we had the weight of a name that acted as both a shield and a target. My father, a man whose hands were stained with the ink of illicit contracts and the salt of sweat, always told me that a woman in our world was a fragile bird in a cage of gold. He didn't realize that even birds learn how to sharpen their beaks. I grew up watching shadows move against the limestone walls of our Chicago estate, learning that power wasn't just about who could pull a trigger, but who could command the man who did. It was a world of rigid codes of omerta, where a whisper could end a life and a handshake was a binding contract till death. I lived on the periphery of the violence, seeing the bruised knuckles at Sunday dinner and the way the air chilled when a rival family's name was mentioned. To survive, you had to be invisible or indispensable. I chose to be a ghost, drifting through the marble halls, gathering secrets like fallen petals. Then came Julian Vane. He wasn't just a man. He was a storm dressed in a charcoal suit. The veins hadn't just encroached on Morty territory, they had swallowed it whole, district by district, with a calculated brutality that made my uncles look like amateurs. Julian was the crown prince of that chaos. I first saw him at a sit down that wasn't supposed to happen, held in the back room of El Eclisi, a restaurant my family owned, where the pasta was handmade and the conversations were lethal. I was 21, tasked with serving the wine, a role designed to keep me close enough to hear but unimportant enough to be ignored. When I poured his glass, the vintage Cabernet was dark as oxidized blood. His fingers brushed mine, and for a second, the room stopped breathing. He didn't look like a monster. He had eyes the color of a winter sea and a jawline that looked carved from granite. But when he looked at me, it wasn't with the dismissive gaze of a made man. It was the look of a predator who had just found something far more interesting than a territory dispute. The vintage is excellent, Sophia, he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in my chest. He shouldn't have known my name. In our world, the daughters of capos were ghosts until they were bargaining chips. My father stiffened beside me, his hand tightening around his own glass. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of pressure that precedes a thunderclap. Julian didn't look at my father. His gaze remained locked on mine, a silent challenge that felt like a match struck in a room full of gasoline. I didn't look away. I couldn't. It was the first time I felt the dangerous pull of the abyss, the realization that some people are born to ruin you and you might just let them. That night, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the kitchen after they had gone, I realized my life was no longer a straight line. It was a jagged edge, and I was already bleeding. 2 weeks later, the rain was a relentless gray sheet over the city, turning the streets into mirrors of neon and grime. I was leaving my art gallery, a small, legitimate venture my father funded to keep me occupied, when the black sedan pulled up. The window rolled down just an inch, revealing nothing but a pair of cold, familiar eyes. I knew I should run. I knew that getting into that car was an act of treason that would get us both buried in a shallow grave in the Jersey Pine Barrens. But the boredom of my sheltered life felt like a slow death, and Julian Vane looked like the only thing that was actually alive. I stepped into the back seat, the scent of leather and sandalwood enveloping me. He didn't say a word as the car pulled away from the curb, heading toward the derelict warehouses near the waterfront. "You're a brave girl or an incredibly stupid one," he said, staring out the window at the passing blur of the city. He didn't look at me, but his hand was resting on the seat between us, inches from mine. I could see the faint scarring on his knuckles, the physical map of a life spent in the dirt. In my house, they're the same thing. I replied, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Why am I here, Julian? If my father's men see me with you, there won't be a sit down this time. There will just be a funeral. He turned then, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. Because I can't stop thinking about the way you poured that wine. Because you look at me like you see exactly who I am and you aren't running. Everyone runs from me, Sophia, or they kneel. I want to know which one you're going to do. Neither, I whispered, the word a lie even as it left my lips. The tension in the car was so thick it felt like something I could touch, a living thing coiled between us. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, a gesture that was shockingly tender and deeply threatening. It was a claim, a mark of possession that defied every rule I had ever been taught. We began a dance that was as beautiful as it was lethal. Midnight meetings in rain-slicked alleys, brief touches in the shadows of gala staircases, and coded messages left in the margins of art books. Julian was a man of shadows, a leader who ruled with a silk glove over a fist of iron. He told me about the night he took over the Vane Empire, how his own uncle had tried to stage a coup, and how Julian had to clean the house. He spoke of it with a clinical detachment that chilled me, yet when he spoke of us, his voice broke with a hunger that was raw and desperate. We are on opposite sides of a line that is written in blood, Sophia, he told me once as we stood on a rooftop overlooking the twinkling lights of the Chicago skyline. The wind whipped my hair across my face, and he reached out to tuck it behind my ear. If I touch you, I'm betraying my men. If you love me, you're killing your father. Do you understand the stakes? I've lived with stakes my whole life, I said, leaning into his touch, the heat of his skin the only thing keeping me upright. Every time my father leaves the house, I don't know if he's coming back. Every time I hear a siren, I wonder if it's for us. I'm tired of being afraid of the end. I want to feel something before it happens. He kissed me then, a desperate, bruising encounter that tasted of salt and forbidden promises. It wasn't a romance, it was a collision. It was the kind of kiss that starts wars, the kind that burns bridges and leaves nothing but ash in its wake. In that moment, I knew I was lost. I had traded my safety for a man who represented everything my family hated, and I had done it with my eyes wide open. The first flashback hit me on a Tuesday, triggered by the smell of ozone before a storm. I was 18 again, sitting in the back of my father's Cadillac. We were stopped at a light when another car pulled alongside us. The windows shattered in a hail of glass and lead. I remember the weight of my father throwing his body over mine, the deafening roar of the submachine guns, and the way the leather seat felt sticky beneath my cheek. My father survived, but his driver, a man who had taught me how to ride a bike, died with his eyes open, staring at the rearview mirror. That was the day I learned that love in the mafia is a liability. It's the soft spot the enemy aims for. As Julian held me in the dark of a safe house years later, I realized I was becoming that soft spot for him and he was becoming mine. Business began to sour between our families. A shipment of luxury goods belonging to the Mortys was intercepted at the docks, and the rumor on the street was that the Vanes had tipped off the feds. My father was a quiet kind of angry, the kind that manifested in hushed phone calls and the cleaning of handguns at the dining table. Someone is talking, my father muttered one evening, his eyes fixed on me across the dinner table. Someone is getting too close to the wolves, Sophia. I hope it's not you. My blood ran cold. He didn't know, not for sure, but the suspicion was there, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon. I had to see Julian. I had to warn him that my father was looking for a scapegoat, and he would gladly offer up a Vane's head on a silver platter. I met Julian at an abandoned pier, the smell of rotting wood and sea salt heavy in the air. He looked tired, the dark circles under his eyes speaking of sleepless nights and the burden of command. When I told him about my father's suspicion, he didn't look surprised. He just pulled me into his arms, his chin resting on the top of my head. I know, he said softly. My men are pushing for a hit. They think I'm being soft. They see me distracted, and in this business, distraction is a death sentence. Then stop, I pleaded, pulling back to look at him. Stop seeing me, go back to your world, and let me go back to mine. We can survive this if we just walk away. Julian's expression hardened, his eyes flashing with a possessive fire that terrified and thrilled me. He grabbed my wrists, holding them tight, not enough to hurt, but enough to make me realize there was no escape. I don't walk away from what's mine, Sophia, and make no mistake, you are mine. Let them start a war. Let the city burn. I'd rather rule a graveyard with you by my side than a kingdom without you. The subtext was clear. He was willing to sacrifice his loyalty to his family for his obsession with me. He was breaking the code of Omerta in his heart, and I was right there with him, holding the match. Another memory surfaced while I was watching my father speak to his consigliere in the garden. I was 10, hiding behind a rose bush. I saw my father hand a heavy envelope to a man who looked like an ordinary accountant. Make sure his family is taken care of, my father had said, but make sure he never speaks again. The man nodded and walked away. A week later, that accountant was found in the river. It was the first time I understood the duality of our life, that you could be taken care of and erased in the same breath. Now, as I played the part of the dutiful daughter while my heart belonged to the enemy, I wondered which phrase my father would use for me when he finally discovered the truth. The pressure began to build like a boiling pot. There was a shooting at a Vein-owned club, followed by a fire at a Morty warehouse. The city was on edge, the police sirens a constant background hum to our lives. Julian and I couldn't meet in person anymore. The risk was too high. We communicated through dead drops, notes tucked into the hollow of a brick wall behind a bakery, or messages left with a trusted, bribed courier. Each note was a lifeline, a reminder that in the middle of the carnage, there was something that felt like love, even if it was twisted and dark. Hold on, his last note had said. I'm finding a way out for both of us. But in the Mafia, there is no out. There is only the grave or the prison cell. I spent my days in a daze, waiting for the phone call that would tell me he was dead, or the knock on the door that would mean my father knew everything. Then came Thomas. Thomas Rossi was the son of my father's oldest ally, a good man by the standards of our world. He was handsome in a safe, predictable way. He didn't have shadows in his eyes, and he didn't smell of danger. My father announced the engagement at a Sunday dinner, his eyes boring into mine as he raised a glass of sparkling wine. To the union of the Morty and Rossi families, he announced, the room erupting in applause. A partnership that will secure our future and settle our debts. I felt like I was drowning. I looked at Thomas, who smiled at me with a warmth that felt like a mockery. To my father, this wasn't just a marriage, it was a treaty. It was a way to fortify our ranks against the veins. I was being used as a pawn to destroy the man I loved. I stayed silent, the taste of ash in my mouth. I couldn't refuse. To refuse was to confess. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of white lace and cold dread. My father kept me under heavy guard, ostensibly for my protection against the vain threat, but I knew it was to keep me from running. I couldn't get a message to Julian. The dead drops went uncollected, the courier disappeared. I began to wonder if he had given up, if the war had finally consumed him, or if he had realized that I wasn't worth the cost of his empire. I sat in my room, surrounded by wedding gifts that felt like tokens of my own funeral, and wept for the girl who thought she could dance with the devil and not get burned. I remember a night shortly after Julian and I had first met. We were in a stolen car parked on a hill overlooking the expressway. "What do you want, Sophia?" he had asked, his voice unusually soft. "If you could strip away the name, the money, the blood." "Who are you?" "I don't know," I had whispered. "I've never been allowed to be anyone else." "I'll show you," he promised, his hand cupping my cheek. "I'll show you a world where you aren't just a Morty. But it's a world that will hate us." "I'm already hated," I had replied. "I might as well be hated for something real." That conversation haunted me as I watched the seamstress pin the hem of my silk bridal gown. I had wanted something real, and I had found it in the most dangerous man in the city. Now I was being forced back into the cage, the gold bars polished to a high shine. The night before the wedding, the air was thick and humid, a storm brewing over the lake. I was sitting on my balcony when I saw a flicker of movement in the shadows of the garden. My heart leaped, but it was just one of my father's guards, his cigarette a glowing ember in the dark. I felt a sense of finality settle over me. This was it. Tomorrow I would belong to Thomas Rossi. I would spend the rest of my life playing the part of the perfect mafia wife, bearing children who would grow up to be soldiers, and burying the memory of Julian Vane deep in the basement of my soul. I went to bed and dreamed of black roses and the sound of a gun cocking in the dark. The morning of the wedding was beautiful, a cruel irony of blue skies and soft breezes. The cathedral was packed with the elite of the underworld, men in bespoke suits with hidden holsters, women in designer dresses with hearts of stone. My father led me down the aisle, his grip on my arm firm, a silent reminder of my duty. I felt like a ghost walking through a dream. Thomas stood at the altar, looking every bit the good man my father wanted for me. He was safety. He was the easy path. But as I reached the altar and turned to face him, all I could think about was the way Julian looked when he was angry, and the way he whispered my name like it was a prayer. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "If any man can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the secrets of every person in that room. I stared at the stained glass, praying for a sign, for a miracle, for anything to stop the ticking clock of my life. Thomas took my hand, his palm sweaty against mine. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear the white silk from my body. "I do," Thomas said, his voice clear and confident. The priest turned to me. "And you, Sophia Morty, do you take this man?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I looked at my father in the front row. He was smiling, a cold, triumphant expression that told me he had won. He had protected his legacy. He had neutralized the threat. Just as I was about to give the answer that would end my life, a heavy thud echoed from the back of the cathedral. The massive oak doors, usually kept shut during the ceremony, groaned on their hinges. A murmur rippled through the pews, a wave of unease that turned into a roar of hushed voices. One of my father's men stood up, his hand reaching for his jacket, but he didn't even get the chance to draw. The doors burst open with the force of a gale, the bright sunlight from outside silhouetting a figure. The figure stepped into the center aisle, and the gasps in the room became a deafening silence. It was Julian, but not the Julian I knew. He was disheveled, his expensive white shirt torn and soaked through with a deep, visceral crimson. Blood was smeared across his cheek, and his eyes were wild, flickering with a terrifying, unhinged light. He looked like he had crawled out of hell itself to be here. He held a handgun at his side, not pointing it at anyone yet, but the threat was radiating off him like heat. The guards at the back were down, slumped in the shadows of the vestibule. Julian walked down the aisle with a slow, deliberate stride, the heels of his boots clicking against the marble like a funeral bell. He didn't look at the guns being drawn all around him. He didn't look at my father, who was now standing, his face contorted in rage. He looked only at me. Stop the wedding, Julian growled, his voice a low, primal sound that tore through the sanctity of the church. He reached the foot of the altar, the scent of gunpowder and copper filling the air around us. Thomas stepped back, his face pale with shock. Julian ignored him, stepping up onto the dais until he was inches from me. He reached out a blood-stained hand, his fingers hovering just inches from my white veil. You're still mine, he said, the words a jagged promise that defied the world. And I'm not leaving without you. The room exploded into chaos, but for a heartbeat, it was just us, a monster and a ghost standing in the ruins of a dream while the world prepared to go to war. The silence in the cathedral wasn't empty, it was a living, breathing monster. 100 years of Catholic tradition and underworld etiquette shattered as Julian Vane stood before the altar, the copper tang of his blood drifting toward me, tainting the scent of the white lilies. My father's hand was already inside his tuxedo jacket, his knuckles white. Behind me, the muffled thuds I'd heard earlier finally made sense. Julian hadn't just walked in. He had cut a path through the Morty's finest soldiers to get to this aisle. He looked like a man who had survived an explosion only to walk directly into a fire. Julian, stop, I whispered, the words trembling. My heart was a frantic bird hitting the cage of my ribs. I looked at Thomas, the good man whose hand I was supposed to hold for eternity. He was frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking at the blood on Julian's shirt as if it were a foreign language he couldn't translate. He was a Rossi, civilized, polished, a man of ledgers. He wasn't equipped for the primal ferocity radiating off the man standing 3 steps below us. Julian didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at the pistols being leveled at his head from the front pews. He looked at me with an intensity that promised both salvation and total destruction. Sophia, step away from him. My father's voice cracked like a whip through the vaulted ceiling. Julian Vane, you are a dead man. You breathe only because I haven't decided which part of you to open first. To come here on this day after what your family did at the docks. It's a suicide note. My father's eyes were slits of obsidian. The air in the church was thick with the ozone of impending violence. Julian finally turned his head slightly, his gaze catching my father's with a chilling nonchalance. He wiped a smear of blood from his jaw with the back of his hand, leaving a red streak across his skin. Your docs were a message, Morty, Julian growled, his voice vibrating in the hollow of my stomach. A message that failed. You thought you could trade her for a Rossi alliance. You thought you could use her as a barricade against the inevitable. Look at her. She doesn't belong in a treaty. She belongs to me. The word me wasn't a romantic notion. It was a claim of territory, a declaration of war. He held out his hand, the fingers stained with the dark residue of the men who had tried to prevent his entry. Sophia, come now. Before this holy ground becomes a slaughterhouse. I didn't think. Thought was a luxury I had abandoned the moment Julian first touched my hand at El Eclisi. To stay was to die a slow death in silk and secrets. To go was to start a war that would likely end in a hail of lead. I took a step toward him. The gasp from the congregation was a collective intake of air, like the city itself was holding its breath. Thomas reached for my arm, his fingers brushing the lace of my sleeve. Sophia, don't. He's a monster. Look at him. I looked at Thomas, at the safety he represented, and then I looked at Julian, the beautiful, bloodied monster who had fought through an army just to tell me I was his. I'm sorry, Thomas, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. I didn't look back. I stepped down the altar stairs, my heavy train following me like a shroud. As my hand met Julian's, a spark of pure, terrifying electricity jolted through me. His grip was iron, hot, and desperate. The moment our skin touched, the first shot rang out. It wasn't Julian who fired, it was one of my father's men from the balcony. The bullet hissed through the air, shattering a marble cherub behind the altar. In an instant, the cathedral transformed into a chaotic symphony of shouting and the metallic slide of handguns being readied. Julian didn't flinch. He pulled me behind the massive stone pillar of the archway, his body a living shield. Keep your head down, he commanded, his breath hot against my ear. He drew his own weapon, a sleek black semi automatic that looked like an extension of his arm. The roar of the pews was deafening, men diving for cover, women screaming as they scrambled for the side exits. My father was shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the sudden, rhythmic thumping of heavy machinery outside. Julian's men had arrived. They weren't just here to extract him, they were here to tear the roof off my life. We have to go now, Julian barked. He grabbed my waist, lifting the heavy layers of my gown so I could move. We sprinted toward the side vestry, bullets chipping away at the ancient wood of the pews behind us. I saw my father's face one last time as we turned the corner, a mask of betrayal and murderous intent. I had committed the ultimate sin in the world of the Cosa Nostra. I had chosen the rival over the blood. I had chosen the wolf over the flock. As the heavy door of the vestry slammed shut behind us, plunging us into temporary darkness, I realized there was no going back. The Sophia Morty who entered this church was dead. We emerged into a narrow alleyway, the gray Chicago rain beginning to fall, turning the blood on Julian's shirt into a pale pink wash. A reinforced SUV was idling at the end of the alley, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a beast. Julian's men, shadowy figures in tactical gear, formed a perimeter, their suppressed weapons spitting silent death at any Morty soldier who dared to poke their head out the side door. Julian pushed me toward the open door of the vehicle, his hand never leaving the small of my back. Drive, Julian roared as the door clicked shut. The SUV lurched forward, tires screaming against the wet pavement. I sat in the plush leather seat, gasping for air, my white dress a grotesque contrast to the violence of the last 5 minutes. Julian sat beside me, his chest heaving, his eyes still scanning the world through the tinted glass. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something that wasn't rage or possession. It was fear, pure, unadulterated fear that he had almost lost the only thing that made him feel human. You're bleeding, I whispered, reaching out to touch the jagged cut above his eyebrow. He caught my hand midair, kissing my palm with a ferocity that made me ache. It's not mine, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Most of it anyway, your father's security at the perimeter. They weren't expecting a frontal assault. They thought the wedding was sacred. They forgot that I don't believe in anything but you. He'll kill us, Julian, you know that. He'll call a commission meeting. He'll put a price on our heads that will make our own shadows turn against us. Let him, Julian said, his thumb tracing the line of my trembling lip. I've been building my own shadow for a long time, Sophia. He thinks I'm the same boy who took over the Vane Empire 3 years ago. He's wrong. I'm the man who's going to burn his empire to save yours. The safe house was a concrete fortress masquerading as a luxury penthouse on the edge of the industrial district. It was filled with monitors, weapon racks, and the cold, clinical hum of high-end surveillance. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows over the city, I stood in the center of the living room, still wearing the tattered remains of my wedding dress. Julian was in the kitchen, splashing water on his face, the sound of his breathing the only thing filling the silence. I walked to the floor to ceiling window, looking out at the skyline. Somewhere out there, my father was planning my funeral. I found out why your father was so desperate for the Rossi alliance, Julian said, coming to stand behind me. He had changed into a clean black shirt, but the smell of gunpowder still clung to his skin. He handed me a glass of amber liquid bourbon. I took a sip, the burn in my throat a welcome distraction. It wasn't just about territory, it was about a debt, a massive, unpayable debt to the outfit in Vegas. He sold you to the Rosses to pay for his gambling losses and a botched shipment that he hid from the capos. I turned, the glass shaking in my hand. My father doesn't gamble. He's a man of discipline. He was, Julian corrected, his eyes dark with the weight of the truth. Until about 6 months ago, he's been hemorrhaging money, Sophia. The Rosses weren't just allies, they were the bank. If you had married Thomas, they would have wiped the slate clean. Now that you've walked out with me, your father is technically a dead man walking unless he can bring your head back to them. The revelation felt like a physical blow. My father, the man who spoke of honor and omerta as if they were holy scripture, had sold me like a piece of livestock to cover his own failures. The loyalty I had felt, the guilt that had been eating at me, it evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline rage. I looked at Julian, seeing him not as my captor or a rival, but as the only person who had ever told me the truth. He wasn't protecting the family, I whispered. He was protecting himself. In this world, they're often the same thing, Julian said, stepping into my space. He took the glass from my hand and set it on the table, his arms wrapping around my waist. The white silk of my dress bunched between us. But you're not his currency anymore. You're my queen, and tonight we start taking back what he stole from you. The first night in the safe house was a fever dream of adrenaline and whispered confessions. We sat on the floor, surrounded by the glow of the monitors, as Julian showed me the extent of his reach. He had been tracking my father's movements for months, identifying the weak points in the Morty infrastructure. He knew about the hidden warehouses, the bribed officials, and the secret ledgers I had spent my childhood trying to find. But there was a deeper secret, one that Julian hesitated to share. There's a reason I came for you today specifically, he said, his voice barely audible. I got word that the Rosses weren't going to let you live past the honeymoon. Thomas didn't want a wife. He wanted a trophy that he could discard once the alliance was cemented. They were going to handle you, Sophia, a tragic accident in the Italian countryside. A flashback hit me then, a memory of Thomas at a gala a year ago. He had been talking to his father, his voice a low, dismissive murmur. She's pretty enough, I suppose, but a Morty bitch has too many teeth. We'll have to pull them eventually. I had dismissed it as tavern talk, the kind of posturing men did to look tough. Now I realized it was a blueprint. My life was a series of death traps, and Julian was the only one who had reached into the machinery to pull me out. Why did you wait until the wedding? I asked, my fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. You could have taken me a week ago, a month ago. I needed you to see, he said, his eyes searching mine. I needed you to see the look on his face. I needed you to know that the world you loved was a lie before I built you a new one. If I had kidnapped you, you would have hated me. If you chose me, you're free. The next morning, the first warning arrived. A black box was left on the doorstep of the penthouse, delivered by a courier who vanished before the cameras could lock on. Julian opened it with a combat knife, his jaw set in a hard line. Inside, nestled in a bed of white lilies identical to the ones from the cathedral, was my mother's wedding ring. It had been buried with her 10 years ago. It was a message from my father. Nothing is sacred, not even the dead. And if he was willing to desecrate my mother's grave to send a message, he was willing to do anything. Julian's face went pale, not with fear, but with a cold, focused malevolence. He picked up the ring and pressed it into my palm. He wants to play with ghosts, fine. We'll give him a haunting he'll never forget. He's baiting you, Julian, I said, my heart cold. He wants you to come to the cemetery. He wants you out in the open. It's a classic setup. I know, Julian replied, a dark smile playing on his lips. But he's forgetting one thing. I don't go where I'm expected. He thinks I'm going to attack his heart. He's wrong. I'm going for his throat. He picked up the phone and made a single call. Phase 2, start the fire at the waterfront. I want every Morty asset in the north side burning by midnight, and tell the Rosses. Tell them if they want their money, they can come and take it from the bottom of the lake. The war had officially begun. For the next 3 days, Chicago became a chessboard of fire and shadow. Reports of industrial accidents and gas leaks filled the news, but we knew the truth. Julian was systematically dismantling the Morty Rossi alliance, one warehouse at a time. We moved between safe houses, never staying in one place for more than 4 hours. The tension was an electric current humming beneath every touch, every kiss. We were living on borrowed time, and the intensity of our connection was amplified by the knowledge that any moment could be our last. We made love in darkened rooms while sirens wailed in the distance, a desperate, silent rebellion against the world that wanted us dead. In a moment of quiet, as we sat in a darkened car outside a suburban social club, Julian spoke about his father. He was a man of the old world, much like yours. He believed that blood was the only currency that mattered. When he died, I realized that blood is cheap. Anyone can spill it. It's the loyalty that's expensive. Do you trust your men? I asked, watching a shadow move across the street. I trust their greed, Julian said simply, and I trust their fear of me, but you. I trust you with the one thing I can't protect, my heart. It's a liability, Sophia. You said it yourself, and now I'm the most vulnerable man in this city. He reached across the seat, his hand cupping the back of my neck, pulling me into a kiss that tasted of bourbon and desperation. If they take me, he whispered against my lips, don't look back. There's a plane waiting at the private airfield. The pilot has the coordinates to a house in Switzerland. Promise me. I'm not leaving you, Julian. We're in this graveyard together. The betrayal came from within, as it always does. We were in a high rise loft preparing for a final sit down with a neutral third party who claimed to have a peace offering from the commission. Julian was checking his weapon when his second in command, a man named Dante who had been with the Vanes for a decade, walked into the room. His face was a mask of regret. I'm sorry, Julian, Dante said, his voice thick. But they offered me the north side and they have my sister. Before Julian could react, the windows of the loft shattered. Flashbangs detonated in a blinding white light, and the world dissolved into ringing ears and searing pain. I felt someone grab me, dragging me across the floor. I heard the muffled roar of Julian's gun, the sound of glass crunching under boots. Another flashback surfaced as I struggled against my captors the day my mother died. She hadn't died of illness, she had died because she had tried to run. I remember seeing my father's face that night. He hadn't looked sad, he had looked inconvenienced. He had cleaned his gun while I cried in the hallway. He had looked at me and said, choices have consequences, Sophia. Remember that. Now, as I was shoved into the back of a van, the smell of my own fear filling the small space, I realized I had made my choice and the consequences were finally here. I was taken to a familiar place, the basement of our family estate. It was cold, the walls smelling of damp limestone and old blood. My father was sitting in a high backed chair, a lamp casting harsh shadows across his face. Thomas Rossi stood beside him, looking smug and untouched. Julian was nowhere to be seen. You've been a very difficult daughter, Sophia, my father said, his voice devoid of any emotion. You've cost me a lot of money. You've cost me a lot of respect, and you've brought a wolf into my house. He's 10 times the man you are, I spat, my hands tied behind my back. At least he's honest about what he is. Thomas stepped forward, his hand striking my face with a sudden, stinging force. Watch your mouth, you're still my property until the priest says otherwise, and we're going to finish that ceremony one way or another. Where is he? I demanded, my vision swimming. Mr. Vane is being handled, my father said, checking his gold watch. He was surprisingly easy to trap once he thought you were in danger. Men like him are always undone by their appetites. He loved you, Sophia. It's the most pathetic thing I've ever seen. A man with his power brought to his knees by a girl in a white dress. My heart shattered, but I kept my face a mask of iron. If Julian was dead, I would follow him, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I looked at the heavy steel door at the end of the room, praying for a miracle I knew wasn't coming. But the thing about wolves is that they don't die easily. A sudden explosion rocked the house, the vibration rattling the floorboards beneath my feet. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. My father stood up, his hand going to his holster. Thomas looked around, panicked. What was that? Thomas yelped. That, I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face, was the sound of your bank account closing. The door at the top of the stairs burst open, and the sound of gunfire poured into the basement. It wasn't the rhythmic fire of professional soldiers. It was the frantic, desperate sound of a man with nothing left to lose. I heard Julian's voice, a raw, guttural roar that echoed through the stone walls. Morty. I'm coming for her. The basement turned into a kill zone. My father's guards engaged Julian's men at the top of the stairs. In the chaos, I managed to lure Thomas closer, his vanity making him want to taunt me one last time. When he leaned in, I threw my weight forward, my head connecting with his nose in a sickening crunch. He fell back, howling in pain, and I scrambled toward the shadows of the water pipes, searching for anything to cut my bonds. My father didn't even look at me. He was focused on the doorway, his gun leveled, waiting for the man who had ruined his plans. Julian appeared in the doorway like a vision of death. He was wounded, a jagged tear in his side, blood soaking through his black shirt, but his eyes were focused and lethal. He fired 3 times, taking out my father's remaining guards with a clinical precision. My father fired back, the bullet grazing Julian's shoulder, but Julian didn't even blink. He kept coming, a relentless force of nature. End of the line, Morty, Julian growled, his gun pointed directly at my father's heart. If you kill me, the Rossies will hunt you to the ends of the earth, my father said, his voice finally showing a tremor of fear. I've already killed the Rosses, Julian said. I sent a team to their compound 20 minutes ago. The bank is closed. I found a sharp piece of metal on the floor and sawed through my zip ties, the plastic biting into my skin until I was free. I stood up just as Julian reached my father. He didn't pull the trigger. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. He was giving me the choice. No, I said, my voice cold. Let him live. Death is too easy for a man who cares so much about his name. Let him watch his empire crumble. Let him watch me walk away with the man he hates. Julian nodded, his gaze never leaving my father's. He lowered his gun, but before we could move, Thomas, who had been forgotten in the corner, lunged forward with a hidden blade. If I can't have you, no one will, he screamed. Julian moved faster than I could follow. He intercepted Thomas midair, the 2 men crashing into the stone wall. The sound of meat hitting stone was sickening. Julian stood over Thomas's crumpled form, his chest heaving. He looked at me, his face softened by a sudden, overwhelming relief. He reached out to me, his hand shaking slightly. I ran to him, my arms wrapping around his neck, the scent of him, smoke, blood, and sandalwood, the only thing that mattered. I've got you, he whispered into my hair. I've got you. But as we turned to lead the way out of the basement, a new sound echoed through the house. Not gunfire, not explosions, but the high pitched, rhythmic chirp of a dozen police sirens. The feds, they hadn't just been watching, they had been waiting for us to finish each other off. Dante, Julian hissed, realization dawning on his face. He didn't just sell us to your father, he sold the whole room to the FBI. We were trapped. To the left, the ruins of my father's estate and his remaining loyalists. To the right, the basement exit, now being swarmed by tactical teams. And in the center, Julian and I, two people who had started a war for love, only to find ourselves in the middle of a checkmate. Julian grabbed my hand, his grip tighter than ever. We have one chance, he said, looking at the narrow ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It leads to the old wine cellar, which connects to the sewer lines. It's a long shot. I've lived my whole life on long shots, I said, but as we climbed toward the shaft, the heavy steel door of the basement was kicked in. A voice boomed through a megaphone, the words chillingly final. This is the FBI. Drop your weapons and put your hands in the air. There is no way out. I looked at Julian, and for the first time, I saw the true weight of the life we had chosen. We weren't just fleeing my father. We were fleeing the law, the underworld, and the very ground we stood on. Julian touched my cheek, his eyes full of a tragic, beautiful love. Whatever happens, he said, you were the only thing that was real. Suddenly, a figure stepped from the shadows behind the FBI team, a face I hadn't seen in years, a face that should have been dead. It was the accountant my father had ordered cleaned when I was 10. He was holding a file, a smirk on his face. Wait, the accountant said to the FBI lead, let them talk. I have some information that might change the priority of these arrests. Information about the Vane Morty merger. I froze. Merger? I looked at Julian, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something. A secret he hadn't told me. A secret that threatened to shatter everything we had built. Julian, I whispered, what is he talking about? Julian didn't answer. He just looked at the accountant, his hand slowly reaching for the gun he had tucked into his waistband, and I realized that the war wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The sirens were a flat, mechanical scream against the humid Chicago night, but it was the silence of the man standing beside me that truly terrified. Julian's hand was still on his weapon, his knuckles a stark, bloodless white. Across the damp basement floor, the accountant, the ghost from my childhood named Elias, stood with a predator's smile. Behind the FBI's tactical shields, the world was ending. But inside the circle of Julian's heat, a new, more intimate destruction was taking place. A merger, Julian, my voice was a thinned out wire, barely holding together. I looked at the man I had traded my soul for, the man who had stormed a cathedral and waded through blood to claim me. Speak to me, tell me he's lying, tell me this wasn't just a business plan. Julian didn't look at me. His winter sea eyes were locked on Elia's. The air in the room felt heavy, pressurized by the presence of a dozen rifles aimed at our hearts. The merger wasn't about the families, Sophia, Julian finally said, his rasp lower and more fractured than I had ever heard it. It was about a way out. I was buying your father's debt. I was absorbing the Morty assets to dissolve them, to make us both disappear. It was a contract of erasure. He's omitting the fine print, Elias chirped, stepping slightly forward as the FBI light signaled for him to stop. To dissolve the Morty line, the heir had to be part of the Vane estate. That was the clause. You weren't just a lover, Sophia. You were the legal bridge to a monopoly. He didn't just save you. He acquired you. The revelation was a cold blade to the chest. Every touch in the dark, every whispered promise on the rain slicked docks, every desperate kiss shared in the shadow of a war. Was it all just a calculated move on a chessboard I hadn't realized I was playing on? I looked at Julian's blood-stained shirt, the crimson now drying into a dark, ugly crust. He had looked like a savior in that cathedral. Now he looked like the architect of a very beautiful cage. Drop the weapon, Vane, the FBI laid boomed, the megaphone distorting his voice into something monstrous. There are 30 men between you and that exit. Don't make this a massacre. Julian's gaze finally shifted to mine. The fear I had seen in him earlier, the fear of losing me, was gone, replaced by a grim, terminal acceptance. He reached out to touch my cheek, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. I did it for the right reasons, Sophia, he whispered. But the world we live in doesn't allow for right reasons. It only allows for results. Look at me. Do you believe I'd let them take you? I saw the truth then, buried deep in his pupils. He hadn't lied about the love, but he had lied about the cost. He was a mafia boss. He didn't know how to love without possessing, and he didn't know how to protect without controlling. I had wanted something real, and I had found it, but reality in our world was made of lied and hollow promises. I don't know who you are, I said, a single tear cutting through the dust on my face. But I know I'm not going back to my father, and I'm not going to a cell. Julian nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. Then we don't drop the gun. He turned his head toward the FBI line, his voice rising to a roar that echoed off the limestone walls. Dante, I know you're back there. You want the north side. You'll have to take it from the ashes. Before the agents could react, Julian didn't fire at them. He fired at the overhead gas line that ran along the basement ceiling, a line he knew was corroded and thin. The world dissolved into a blinding orange flash and a wall of heat that knocked the breath from my lungs. The explosion wasn't a death blow, it was a curtain of fire. Smoke, thick and acrid, filled the basement in seconds, blinding the tactical team and throwing the room into a hellish, flickering chaos. Julian lunged for me, his arm wrapping around my waist, hoisting me up toward the narrow ventilation shaft we had spotted earlier. Go, he coughed, the heat singeing the hair at his temples. It leads to the old wine cellar. The grate is already loose. Move, Sophia. What about you? I screamed over the roar of the fire and the sudden, frantic shouting of the agents. I'm right behind you, he lied. I knew it was a lie the moment he said it. His eyes were focused on the steel door, where shadows were already moving through the smoke. He was going to stay. He was going to be the wall that allowed me to slip into the dark. I grabbed the lapels of his black shirt, pulling him down until our foreheads pressed together. No more lies, Julian. If you don't come through that shaft, I'm walking back into the fire. I mean it. I won't be a queen of a graveyard. A flicker of the old Julian, the man from the car, the man from the rooftop, returned. He kissed me with a desperation that tasted of ash and copper. 5 minutes, he gasped. Get to the cellar. I'll be there in 5 minutes. I scrambled into the shaft, my white wedding dress now a blackened rag, the metal ductwork scraping my skin. I crawled with a strength I didn't know I possessed, the sound of gunfire erupting in the basement behind me. Each shot was a hammer blow to my heart. I reached the end of the shaft and kicked the grate out, tumbling into a cold, damp room filled with the scent of fermenting grapes and old dust. I landed hard, gasping for air, and turned to look back at the hole I had just emerged from. The wine cellar was a silent tomb. I waited, counting the seconds, the minutes, the pulse in my own throat. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by a distant, muffled shouting and the crackle of the flames above. 1 minute, three, five, the shaft remained empty. I looked around the room, searching for a weapon, a tool, anything. My father's old wine collection stood in racks like silent sentinels. I found a heavy, wrought iron fire poker near the dormant hearth. If Julian didn't come through that shaft, I was going to crawl back in. I was done being the girl who waited for men to decide her fate. Just as I moved toward the shaft, a hand reached out from the darkness of the cellar's far corner, not the shaft, the door. Sophia, it was Thomas. He was leaning against the stone archway, his face a bruised mess from where I had headbutted him. He looked pathetic, but he held a small silver pistol in a steady hand. You really thought he could save you. Julian Vane is currently being pinned down by a dozen feds and your father's remaining men. He's not coming for you. No one is coming for you. You're late, Thomas, I said, gripping the iron poker. The bank is closed. Your father is dead. My father is ruined. What exactly are you fighting for? I'm fighting for what's mine, Thomas spat, his eyes bulging with a localized insanity. You were the deal, you were the trophy. If I don't get the alliance, I at least get the satisfaction of knowing he didn't win either. He raised the gun, and for a second, I felt the cold breath of the afterlife. But then a shadow detached itself from the ceiling above Thomas. A figure dropped with the silence of a falling leaf, a blade flashing in the dim light of the cellar. Julian didn't look like a boss then. He looked like a vengeful spirit. He slammed into Thomas, the two of them crashing into a rack of vintage Cabernet. Glass shattered and dark red liquid spilled across the floor, looking hauntingly like the blood Julian had arrived in at the church. The struggle was brief and brutal. Julian didn't use a gun, he used his hands. He fought with a primal, messy rage that finally laid to rest the good man my father had chosen for me. When Julian stood up, Thomas was no longer a threat. Julian was gasping, his side soaked in fresh blood, his shoulder drooping. He looked at me and his knees finally buckled. I ran to him, catching him before he hit the stone floor. We sat together in the spilled wine and shattered glass, the sirens now a distant hum above our heads. You came, I whispered, pulling his head to my chest. I told you, he wheezed, a ghost of a smile on his lips. 5 minutes. I'm a man of my word. We have to move, Julian. The feds will find the cellar. The house is burning. The sewer line, he said, gesturing toward a heavy wooden door at the back of the cellar. It leads to the drainage tunnels, my car. The other car is at the exit on 5th and Main. Sophia, take the file. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled, blood-stained folder. It was the merger file Elias had mentioned. Burn it. If the feds get it, they have the paper trail to every vein and Morty asset in the country. If you burn it, they have nothing but a burnt-out house and a pile of bodies. You'll be clean. You can walk away. I'm not walking away without you. I can't run, he said, his eyes going misty. The bullet in my side. It hit something vital. I can feel the cold, Sophia. It's okay. I got you out. That was the only part of the contract that mattered. A flashback hit me, sharper than the cold air of the cellar. I was 12 and I was watching my mother look out the window at the rain. Why do you stay, Mama? I had asked. She had turned to me, her eyes full of a tragic beauty. Because sometimes the person who breaks your heart is the only one who knows how to hold the pieces. I looked at Julian, the man who had acquired me, lied to me, and destroyed my world, and I realized I was my mother's daughter. But I wouldn't stay to watch him die. I would make him live, even if it meant being a ghost for the rest of our lives. You're going to run, I said, my voice hardening into the iron of the Morty name. Because if you die here, Julian Vane, I'm going to find your brother, I'm going to find Dante, and I'm going to burn the rest of this city to the ground. You want to see me be a queen? Then give me a king to stand beside. I hauled him up. I didn't care about the pain in his side or the blood on my dress. I draped his heavy arm over my shoulder and dragged him toward the wooden door. I was the bird who had sharpened her beak, and it was time to tear my way out of the cage. The tunnels were a labyrinth of darkness and the smell of damp earth. We moved like wounded animals, Julian's weight nearly crushing me. Every step was a prayer. We heard the echoing shouts of the tactical teams behind us, the sound of boots on stone. They were coming. Leave me, Julian hissed, his head lolling. They're too close. Shut up and walk. We reached the ladder to the street level just as the first flashlights flickered at the far end of the tunnel. I pushed Julian up the rungs, my muscles screaming in protest. We emerged into the cool night air of a side street 3 blocks away from the burning estate. The black sedan was there, idling, the driver, not Dante, but a young kid Julian had once saved from the streets, waiting with the door open. We threw ourselves into the car, and the world became a blur of speed and city lights. I took the merger file and a lighter from the glove box. I watched the paper blacken and curl, the signatures of the men who had tried to own me turning into ash that blew out the window into the Chicago wind. Where to? The driver asked, his voice trembling. The airfield, Julian murmured from the seat beside me. He was pale, but he was breathing. The bleeding had slowed. Switzerland. Tell them the cargo is secure. I looked out the window as we passed the cathedral where this had all begun. It stood silent and dark, its stained glass reflecting the distant glow of the fire at the Morty estate. I thought of the girl who had walked down that aisle in white lace, ready to marry a good man. She was gone. Julian, I said, reaching over to grip his hand. His fingers were cold, but they closed around mine with a familiar, possessive strength. The merger, is there anything else in those files? Anything I should know? He looked at me, a flicker of the old predator in his eyes. Only that I love you, and that's the most dangerous secret of all. 6 months later. The air in the Swiss Alps was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the whiskey and cigar smoke of my youth. Our house was a secluded villa overlooking a lake that was the color of Julian's eyes on a clear day. There were no sirens here. No sit downs, just the wind through the pines and the silence of a life built on ruins. Julian walked out onto the terrace wearing a simple linen shirt. He moved with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night the cathedral fell, but the color had returned to his face. He came to stand behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. You're thinking about it again, he said. Sometimes I hear the sirens, I admitted, leaning back into him. Sometimes I wonder if my father is still looking or if Dante is still ruling the north side. Let them look, Julian said, his voice a low, soothing rasp. Let them rule a graveyard. We're dead to them, Sophia. That was the price. I looked at my hand. I wasn't wearing my mother's ring. I wasn't wearing a Rossi diamond. I was wearing a simple gold band Julian had given me in a small chapel in the mountains. It didn't represent an alliance or a debt, it represented a choice. Do you regret it? I asked, turning in his arms. The empire, the power, you were a king, Julian. He looked out at the lake and then back at me. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, just as he had in the car 6 months ago. The touch still made my breath hitch. The danger was gone, but the intensity, that dark, magnetic pull, would never leave us. I was a man in a cage, just like you, he said. The only thing I regret is that I didn't burn that church down sooner. We went inside as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows over the valley. Our life was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. You don't spend a lifetime in the shadows and expect the light to be easy. We still looked over our shoulders. We still kept weapons in the nightstands. We were made of the world we had left behind, and that world always collects its due. But as I watched Julian pour 2 glasses of wine, a vintage he had searched for specifically because it reminded him of our first night at El Eclisi, I realized that we had won. In a world defined by loyalty to blood and the silence of omerta, we had committed the ultimate betrayal. We had chosen ourselves. I walked to the window and looked at the reflection of the room in the glass. I was no longer a ghost in marble halls. I was a woman who had seen the abyss and decided to dance on the edge of it. To the merger, I said, raising my glass. Julian clinked his glass against mine, his eyes dark with a love that was still a little bit like a threat. To the only contract that matters. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the world in a clean, white shroud. Somewhere in Chicago, the pews of a cathedral were being repaired, and a new generation of soldiers was being born into the dark. But here, in the silence, the bird had finally found a sky big enough to fly in. They say in our world, you die the moment you feel something. I had died a dozen deaths in the arms of Julian Vane. I had died in a hail of bullets, in a wall of fire, and in the shattering of every lie I had ever believed. But as he pulled me into his arms, the scent of sandalwood and home finally replacing the smell of blood, I knew that being dead never felt so much like living. The shadows moved like promises against the villa walls, but they didn't frighten me anymore. I knew the man who controlled the shadows, and more importantly, I knew the woman who commanded him. You're still mine, he whispered against my neck, the words no longer a growl, but a vow. Always, I replied. The city lights of my past were thousands of miles away, but as the moon rose over the Alps, I knew that no matter where we went, the Mafia would always be a part of us. It was in the way we touched, the way we guarded each other, and the way we loved with a ferocity that defied all the rules of the underworld. We were the Vanes, we were the Mortys, and we were finally free. The final image I carry is not the blood on Julian's shirt or the fire in my father's eyes. It's the two of us standing on that balcony, looking out at a world that doesn't know we exist. The story of Sophia Morty ended in a cathedral. The story of the woman standing in the mountains was just beginning. And as the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks of our escape, I realized that some loves are not meant to save you. They are meant to change you until you no longer need saving. The noir world of the Chicago streets was a lifetime ago. But every now and then, when the wind howls through the pines, I can still hear the rasp of a voice saying my name, and I know that the most dangerous thing I ever did was say, I do to the man who stopped the wedding. In the end, that's the art of the underworld, learning that the most beautiful things grow in the dark, and that the only thing more powerful than a made man is a woman who has nothing left to fear. Ready? Julian asked, extending his hand toward the dinner table. Ready, I said, taking it. The door closed, the light from the villa spilling out onto the snow for one brief second before the world returned to the beautiful, perfect dark.